At 63, Nell Newman, the daughter of a man whose blue eyes once made an entire century, exhale finally broke her silence. In a rare sit-down on CBS Sunday Morning, her words didn't merely chip a legend's marble, they split the statue down the middle, exposing the oldest riddle of fame. What truth gets buried so the myth can live? Because between the two lives of Paul Newman, the one staged for the public and the one whispered after the lights went dark, there was always a border no one dared cross. Westport's windows reflected a perfect family. Inside, empty chairs, midnight phone calls, and old photographs folded into quarters suggested a different script. Some nights, a low laugh drifted from his study during long-distance calls. It was never to her mother. Then came the final will, a cold document, according to family accounts, that redrew the map of memory and money. Vast assets did not travel where the public assumed. Between legal phrases and signatures, a rumor flashed like a match, two initials, RR. Not a full name, but enough to rekindle an old speculation. Was there a love that never learned to say its own name? If so, what was the cost? A wife with a memory chipped by sorrow, children raised in silence, a philanthropic empire that some say hardened into a fortress without family keys. Nell spoke little, but each sentence felt like a scissor stroke through the velvet curtain that had dazzled a half-century of audiences. Perhaps behind those immortal blue eyes wasn't the emblem of perfection, but a man running from his own truth. And yet the deepest secret still hasn't been named. It begins with a winter night, a handwritten letter, and a name Hollywood always called a soulmate. But the largest shadow in his life only took shape when that room's light flicked on, ready to open the first door. For half a century, Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward were Hollywood's golden pair. He was the man whose every glance carried gravity, whose silence could outshine dialogue. She was the woman who made fragility feel like strength. Together, they became the industry's proof that love could survive the spotlight. Every photograph of them looked like a promise one the world wanted desperately to believe. They met in the late 1950s when Hollywood still believed in fairy tales. The silver screen was an altar, and actors were its saints. When Paul and Joanne fell in love on the set of The Long Hot Summer, it seemed written by fate itself. He was already married, she was ambitious, and yet against the odds, they found each other. Their chemistry was electric raw and dangerously real. When he left his first wife to be with her, it shocked the press, but audiences forgave him. Because some stories were too beautiful to condemn, they married, built a home in Westport, Connecticut, and raised 6 children. On camera, they were radiant, the embodiment of faithfulness. Why go out for a hamburger, Paul once joked, when you have steak at home? That line would be printed on posters and quoted for decades as proof of his loyalty. Yet those who lived within their orbit whispered something different, that the man who could be so open with the world was strangely closed within his own house. Behind the glass of family portraits, the air felt colder than it looked. Joanne, once so luminous, began to move with a kind of fragile distance. Paul threw himself deeper into work, film after film, race after race, charity after charity, as if motion itself could keep truth at bay. Hollywood saw purpose. His family saw absence. He became a legend of contradictions, a man who fought for justice but struggled with intimacy, a symbol of virtue who spent his life haunted by something unnamed. The blue eyes that had captivated millions were mirrors reflecting everything except what lay behind them. As his fame grew, so did the silence. Reporters called him the last gentleman of Hollywood. Admirers called him perfect. His wife called him home less and less. And his children learned early that in their house love was something you didn't talk about, only performed. To the world, Paul Newman was eternal. To his daughter Nell, he was a question that no one dared to ask. It was only decades later, long after the applause had faded and the cameras had gone dark, that she would begin to understand what had been hidden in plain sight all along. The perfect marriage, the flawless family, the legend built on silence. Westport, Connecticut, a town where the air smelled of sea salt and money, where every garden was perfectly trimmed and every secret perfectly hidden. It was here that little Nell Newman grew up, a blonde-haired girl who loved to draw trees in the garden while her parents were away on set. To the world, she belonged to Hollywood royalty, but to herself, she was a child inside a house that never learned how to speak. In Nell's memory, her home was always quiet, not the kind of silence that brings peace, but the kind that hums beneath the walls like something waiting to break. Her father, Paul, was either in his study or gone for days. Her mother, Joanne, floated through rooms like a ghost of her younger self, elegant, composed, unreachable. "I used to think our family was perfect," Nell once said, "just like the framed photographs hanging neatly on the walls. But then I realized photographs don't speak, and neither did we." Not once did she see her parents hold hands. The affection the world saw on red carpets vanished the moment the cameras turned away. Their love, if it still existed, had become a performance, a script rehearsed too many times. Some nights Nell would hear the soft clink of a wineglass shattering. Her mother's muffled sobs followed, repeating a phrase she didn't yet understand: "You lied again." When Nell asked what her father had done, Joanne only whispered, trembling, "Not every man loves women, darling. But Hollywood will never accept that." The words sank into Nell like frost. She was too young to understand them, but old enough to feel their weight. Later, rummaging through her father's things, she found a Polaroid tucked in his wallet, a picture of him smiling with another man. The look in Paul's eyes wasn't the look of friendship. It was something deeper, softer, dangerous in its honesty. When Nell showed her mother, Joanne snatched the photo, tore it apart, and fed it to the fire. "We will never speak of this," she said. And from that night onward, Nell learned the unspoken law of the Newman household. Never ask where father goes. Never ask why mother takes sleeping pills. Never ask why they sleep on different floors. And above all, never ask about love. We lived surrounded by awe. The older she grew, the more she noticed how every guest who entered the house changed the air, especially when names like Gore Vidal or Robert Redford were mentioned, faces familiar to the world, yet somehow uneasy in her mother's eyes. Her father would dress impeccably, wear a fragrance she didn't recognize, and the night would always end with the sound of his study door locking. When he laughed, it was never the laugh of a father. It was the laughter of a man who belonged somewhere else. And slowly, Nell began to realize that every smile in her house was a kind of disguise, beautiful, practiced, and empty, because in the home of America's most beloved couple, happiness was never real. It was only rehearsed. Long before the scandals, long before his name became a monument, Paul Newman was just a man chasing the same dream as thousands of others: to be seen. He arrived in New York in the early 1950s, young, striking, and full of quiet defiance. His beauty was almost inconvenient. It blinded people to how hard he worked. Casting agents didn't see an actor, they saw a face. But Newman was determined to prove that beneath the flawless skin and ice-blue eyes, there was something real, a soul that could burn. He began with theater, hungry and humble. At the Actors Studio, he studied method acting beside Brando Dean and Cliff, names that defined rebellion. Yet Paul was different. While others exploded on screen, he imploded. His performances drew you in, not by force, but by restraint. There was always a storm hiding just beneath his calm. In 1958, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof made him a household name. He played Brick, a man wrestling with unspoken shame, a role that mirrored more of himself than anyone knew. Critics praised his subtlety, his intensity, his sadness. Audiences swooned. But in interviews, Paul brushed it off. "I just like a good story," he'd say. Yet behind those modest words was a man terrified of being recognized not as a celebrity, but as himself. On set, he met Joanne Woodward, the woman who would both complete and complicate his life. She was everything he admired: intelligent, grounded, unpretentious. They married quickly, built a family, and became the industry's symbol of endurance. But even in those early years, cracks began to show. When Joanne spoke of acting, her eyes lit up. When Paul spoke of racing, hers dimmed. They lived together but in different worlds. Between film shoots, interviews, and charity events, Paul began disappearing more often. Business trips that stretched longer than expected, phone calls taken behind closed doors. Fame became his armor. Every award, every headline, every philanthropic gesture layered over something fragile and unspeakable. Friends said he was a man too decent to be dishonest and too afraid to be truthful. That paradox became the blueprint of his life. Hollywood adored him. Directors called him the perfect leading man, masculine, moral, magnetic. But at home, Joanne was raising children who saw their father mostly in magazines. Nell later recalled, "He was everywhere except where we needed him." As the world celebrated Paul Newman's rise, his family began learning what success really cost. Fame, after all, isn't light, it's fire. And in the Newman household, that fire had already begun to burn quietly beneath the walls. By the mid-1960s, Paul Newman was no longer just a movie star, he was a symbol. Every studio wanted his name above the title, every director wanted his approval, every woman wanted the man with the blue eyes that seemed to hold the ocean. His face appeared on magazine covers, perfume ads, posters, cereal boxes. Hollywood had found its golden standard of masculinity. With The Hustler, Cool Hand, Luke and Butch Cassidy, and The Sundance Kid, he became the embodiment of charm and rebellion. Men admired him, women adored him, but the applause that surrounded him at every premiere couldn't drown out the low hum of something unsatisfied. He had everything, one friend said later, but it never seemed enough. He was always looking at the horizon as if he'd left something behind. At home, Joanne Woodward was building her own empire of grace. She won an Academy Award, directed plays, raised 6 children, and still found time to host dinner parties that the press called the happiest gatherings in Connecticut. Yet those who knew them privately spoke of evenings that ended in silence. Paul would sit outside on the porch with a drink in hand, staring into the dark, while Joanne washed the dishes alone. Hollywood crowned them the eternal couple. They smiled at events, held hands for the cameras, and fed the public the image it needed: love, unbroken, fidelity, unshaken. But when the lights dimmed, that love became a quiet negotiation between 2 weary actors performing the same scene for too many years. During this era, Newman began channeling his restlessness into motion car racing. The roar of engines replaced the stillness of his home. Behind the wheel, he could disappear, just another man in a helmet, anonymous, free. Joanne supported him publicly, but in private she confessed to friends that she no longer recognized the man she'd married. Still, to the world, they were untouchable. Time magazine called him Hollywood's conscience. Life called her the woman who tamed the rebel. Together they represented a myth America desperately wanted to believe in, that fame could coexist with integrity, that beauty could coexist with loyalty. But inside the myth, their marriage had begun to erode. The walls of Westport whispered arguments muffled behind closed doors, the sound of another glass breaking, another question left unanswered. For every photograph of Paul's smile, there was a shadow just outside the frame of guilt, distance, or longing for something unnamed. Joanne once told a close friend, "He's not unfaithful to me in the way people think. It's worse, he's unfaithful to himself." And while the cameras continued to worship the legend, that private fracture deepened, setting the stage for the tragedy that would one day break the Newman family apart. The house in Westport grew quieter as the years passed, the silence turning dense like fog that never lifted. Fame had done what fame always does. It filled the world outside and hollowed the one within. In 1972, Nell remembered a sound that shattered that silence, the crash of a wine glass hitting her mother's bedroom floor. She ran to find Joanne Woodward, kneeling on the carpet, her hands trembling, the words spilling out like broken glass. "You lied again. You lied again." It was the first moment Nell understood that their family's perfection had always been an illusion drawn in smoke. Her father had grown distant, unpredictable. He would leave without explanation, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks, and when he returned, he brought with him a strange stillness, as if his body had come home, but his soul was still elsewhere. The laughter that escaped from his study late at night belonged to another life. It was never meant for Joanne. The more Nell tried to make sense of it, the more she realized that every attempt ended in silence. In our house, she said, questions were like fire. You could warm yourself with them for a second, but if you held on, they burned. And then came Scott Newman, the son who would not stay silent. Brilliant, defiant, desperate for his father's love. Hollywood called him Paul's mirror, but the reflection was painful to watch. Scott saw what the others pretended not to, that their father's warmth belonged to the world, not to them. In high school, he fought, drank, raged. By 20, he was already unraveling. He carried our silence like a disease, Nell recalled. He was the first to ask the forbidden question, and he paid for it. In 1978, Scott was found dead in his Los Angeles apartment, a victim of overdose. The world called it tragedy. Nell called it consequence. He didn't die from drugs, she said years later. He died from not being heard. After that night, the house changed forever. Paul stopped speaking for long stretches. Joanne began to move through the rooms as if they were someone else's home. The children grew older, but none of them ever grew away from the ache. Then one winter evening in 1981, Nell passed by her father's study and saw light spilling from under the door. She peered through the crack and saw him writing. His face, usually so composed, was wet with tears. On the desk lay a stack of handwritten pages addressed to someone named Red. Dear Red, the letter began, you remind me that I am still human, not just a symbol. The words that followed were raw, tender, intimate, the kind a man writes only once in a lifetime. He spoke of nights in the desert during Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, of glances held too long of a friendship that the world would never understand. For Nell, it was both revelation and confirmation. The stories whispered in the shadows, the tension that had filled her home, the way her father's eyes softened. Only for certain people, it all converged in that one letter. She placed it back on his desk before he returned, but nothing in her world ever looked the same again. The myths about Paul Newman had always been golden. The truth whispered between those pages was blue and cold as the eyes that had built his legend. And from that moment on, Nell carried her father's secret the way he had carried it his entire life in silence. By the late 1990s, Paul Newman had become something larger than life, a statesman of Hollywood, a philanthropist, a symbol of decency in an industry addicted to decay. He had given away hundreds of millions through Newman's own race cars well into his 70s and stood beside presidents and protesters alike. To the world, he was immortal. To his family, he was already fading into myth. Joanne Woodward, once radiant on screen, began to drift into illness. Alzheimer's crept into her days like an invisible thief. She forgot lines, names, faces, but never the look in her husband's eyes whenever someone mentioned the name Robert Redford. Even when she didn't remember who she was, Nell later said she still remembered him. Nell would visit her mother at the nursing home in Westport, bringing flowers, photos, sometimes old movie posters. One day, Joanne held a picture from the 1970s Golden Globes, stared for a long time, and asked softly, "Do I know this man?" The man was Paul. Her daughter nodded, too heartbroken to speak, but the name that escaped Joanne's lips next was not his. It was Robert. No one knows what those two men truly shared, friendship, collaboration, or something that never had permission to exist. The truth stayed buried between them, yet even in Joanne's unraveling mind, it still lived sharp, unforgotten. Paul grew quieter as his body began to fail. He stopped racing, stopped acting, stopped pretending. At night, Nell would find him sitting on the porch, a glass of whiskey in hand, staring into the dark. He would whisper to no one, "I just want peace." But peace for Paul Newman was never simple. When his health declined, lawyers began to visit the house more frequently. Contracts, trusts, and documents piled up on the oak desk in his study. Nell remembered seeing her father's familiar handwriting, trembling on the final page of a new will signed just weeks before his death. When the document was read, it was like a second death. The vast fortune of Newman's own, the company he had built from laughter and salad dressing, was left entirely to a foundation run by Robert Forrester, a man few in the family truly knew. Joanne and the children received nothing. For the world, the gesture looked noble, a final act of charity, but to Nell, it felt like erasure. "We didn't just lose our father," she said later. "We lost the chance to ever really know who he was." There were whispers that Paul had been confused, that his mind had begun to slip. Medical records suggested lapses in judgment, memory loss, even temporary incapacity. Yet those papers vanished from the official file. Lawyers said the will was valid, airtight, untouchable. In the years that followed, the Newman family fractured. The foundation thrived, but the people it was meant to honor were locked out. Joanne faded further into her illness, remembering only fragments of a man she had loved, feared, and forgiven. Nell, now gray-haired and calm, spoke rarely, except to say, "The only truth that matters is the one he couldn't speak aloud." When Paul Newman took his final breath in 2008, the nation mourned a hero. But inside the house in Westport, there was no sound but the rustle of old letters and the echo of questions that would never be answered. By the late 1990s, Paul Newman had become something larger than life, a statesman of Hollywood, a philanthropist, a symbol of decency in an industry addicted to decay. He had given away hundreds of millions through Newman's own race cars well into his 70s and stood beside presidents and protesters alike. To the world, he was immortal. To his family, he was already fading into myth. Joanne Woodward, once radiant on screen, began to drift into illness. Alzheimer's crept into her days like an invisible thief. She forgot lines, names, faces, but never the look in her husband's eyes whenever someone mentioned the name Robert Redford. Even when she didn't remember who she was, Nell later said she still remembered him. Nell would visit her mother at the nursing home in Westport, bringing flowers, photos, sometimes old movie posters. One day, Joanne held a picture from the 1970s Golden Globes, stared for a long time, and asked softly, "Do I know this man?" The man was Paul. Her daughter nodded, too heartbroken to speak, but the name that escaped Joanne's lips next was not his. It was Robert. No one knows what those two men truly shared, friendship, collaboration, or something that never had permission to exist. The truth stayed buried between them. Yet even in Joanne's unraveling mind, it still lived sharp, unforgotten. Paul grew quieter as his body began to fail. He stopped racing, stopped acting, stopped pretending. At night, Nell would find him sitting on the porch, a glass of whiskey in hand, staring into the dark. He would whisper to no one, "I just want peace." But peace for Paul Newman was never simple. When his health declined, lawyers began to visit the house more frequently. Contracts, trusts, and documents piled up on the oak desk in his study. Nell remembered seeing her father's familiar handwriting trembling on the final page of a new will signed just weeks before his death. When the document was read, it was like a second death. The vast fortune of Newman's own, the company he had built from laughter and salad dressing, was left entirely to a foundation run by Robert Forrester, a man few in the family truly knew. Joanne and the children received nothing. For the world, the gesture looked noble, a final act of charity. But to Nell, it felt like erasure. "We didn't just lose our father," she said later. "We lost the chance to ever really know who he was." There were whispers that Paul had been confused, that his mind had begun to slip. Medical records suggested lapses in judgment, memory loss, even temporary incapacity. Yet those papers vanished from the official file. Lawyers said the will was valid, airtight, untouchable. In the years that followed, the Newman family fractured. The foundation thrived, but the people it was meant to honor were locked out. Joanne faded further into her illness, remembering only fragments of a man she had loved, feared, and forgiven. Nell, now gray-haired and calm, spoke rarely, except to say, The only truth that matters is the one he couldn't speak aloud. When Paul Newman took his final breath in 2008, the nation mourned a hero. But inside the house in Westport, there was no sound but the rustle of old letters and the echo of questions that would never be answered. History has a strange way of polishing the men it wants to remember. For decades after his death, Paul Newman remained an untouchable icon, the rebel with angel eyes, the philanthropist who turned fame into good, the last gentleman of a vanished Hollywood. His face still smiled from the labels of Newman's own. His name still carried the perfume of integrity. To millions, he was proof that you could be powerful and kind at once. But beneath that halo, the story was never so simple. Those who loved him most were left to piece together a legacy that felt both magnificent and merciless. The empire he built in the name of generosity became in time a fortress guarded by strangers. The foundation flourished, yet the family that bore his name was quietly written out of its walls. Nell once said, "My father built a kingdom on goodness, but sometimes goodness can be used to hide what we can't face." Her words, spoken without anger, carried a weight that lingered longer than any scandal. Because what she meant wasn't greed, it was memory. It was the way the world had turned a man into a monument, and in doing so erased the man himself. Still, Paul Newman's mark on culture cannot be denied. He redefined masculinity at a time when men weren't allowed to feel. His performances, the hustler cool hand Luke, the verdict carried a quiet ache that audiences never forgot. He gave vulnerability a face that was both strong and human. In that sense, he changed Hollywood forever. Yet his true legacy, the one the tabloids never touch, lies in the silence he left behind. It is the silence of families who never ask the hardest questions, of children who grow up worshiping a father they never really knew, of artists who mistake their public selves for their private hearts. The man the world called perfect spent his life trying to be forgiven for something unnamed. The wife the world envied spent hers learning how to love a ghost. And the daughter who inherited both of their shadows has spent her years searching for a truth she may never find. In that sense, Paul Newman's story is no longer just about one man. It has become a reflection of Hollywood itself, dazzling, generous, and full of secrets that no one dares to speak. And still, through every film, every charity, every myth retold, one question remains suspended in the air like smoke. How much of our goodness is truth, and how much is the mask we wear to survive? There are stories that ask to be told, and there are stories that resist the light. Paul Newman's story is both. To the public, he was the rarest kind of legend, one who gave more than he took, who turned fame into fuel for kindness. Even today, his foundation feeds millions. His films still breathe across generations, and his face remains synonymous with grace. Yet behind that enduring legacy lies a truth both simple and devastating. Greatness does not protect anyone from loneliness. The world needed him to be flawless. Hollywood needed him to be noble, and maybe he needed that too, the applause, the philanthropy, the armor of goodness to keep from facing the deeper ache inside. Every saint that Hollywood builds begins with a man afraid to disappoint someone. Nell Newman's quiet courage in breaking that silence decades later is not an act of betrayal. It is an act of love. She did not speak to destroy her father's myth, but to reclaim the man who had been buried beneath it, the father who was kind and generous, but also secretive and conflicted, the man who made the world believe in sincerity while struggling to live sincerely with himself. It's easy to celebrate heroes. It's harder to see the cracks that make them human. Yet maybe that's where the truth lies, not in the polished surface, but in the fracture beneath it. Paul Newman's tragedy isn't that he deceived the world. It's that he could never give the same honesty to himself that he gave to his audience. His greatest performances were not on film, but in life, where he spent decades pretending to be the man he wished he could be. And for that, perhaps we shouldn't condemn him. We should understand him, because the need to hide our pain is as human as the desire to be loved. In the end, Paul Newman was neither hero nor villain. He was what we all are: flawed, brilliant, contradictory, and searching for peace. And maybe that is his truest legacy, the reminder that even legends break quietly, and that behind every masterpiece of light lies a man learning to live with his shadow. The wind in Westport still moves through the maples the way it did when Nell was a child. The porch light outside the old Newman house flickers at dusk, throwing long shadows across the garden her father once tended in quiet hours between fame and flight. Sometimes neighbors say they still see her sitting there, wrapped in an old shawl, listening to the trees sway as if waiting for a voice that no longer exists. There is a gentleness to the silence now, though it is not peace. It is the kind of stillness that carries both love and absence, the strange balance between remembering and forgiving. For Nell, her father's legacy is no longer measured in dollars, awards, or photographs. It exists in fragments: a half-burned letter, a smile frozen in film, a sentence that ends before it should. She once said, "I think I finally understand him. He wanted to be loved, but he didn't know how to live in that love." And perhaps that is what makes the story of Paul Newman so haunting, that a man who could make millions believe in truth on screen could not bear to live it when the cameras stopped rolling. Hollywood has already moved on. New generations watch his films without hearing the ache between his lines. The legend remains untarnished, glittering in memory. But somewhere behind that shimmer lies the quiet question that his daughter and maybe all of us keep asking: how much of our lives do we live in truth, and how much inside the roles we build to survive? In the end, there is no verdict, only echoes. A man who lived for light, a woman who loved him through shadows, and a daughter who carries both inside her heart. The rest is silence, beautiful, endless, unanswerable. Some stories were never meant to be known, but now you know.